Hello! Okay, after our fantastic experience in the Royal College yesterday, I started thinking, what is it I'm going to do for these folks in terms of a video? The last thing you want is another 40 minutes of me droning on at you. So I thought, short and sweet, maybe what I could do is I could think about doing 10-minute briefings on the key ideas in the core areas of the class. Well, hello everybody. 10 very quick minutes on leading change. Okay, so I guess a great place to start is to look at the underlying questions of why would we want to look at something like this. And the short answer is that everybody kind of expects the person who is in charge of a particular area or is given the authority and the responsibility to make change is in some way obliged to answer those expectations. You heard it spoken about in week one when David Sims was talking in the workshop video around why do managers change, or why is that important to manage? Because it's kind of, if you're not doing that, what else are you doing in your role? Now that kind of signals in some way that leadership and change are intrinsically linked together, that even if you come in as somebody who is great at handling a particular situation, a changing set of contexts or a changing environment is one where people will look to the individual in authority to deliver an explanation of what they're supposed to do or to formulate a way forward. Okay, so leadership and change pretty much intrinsically linked. That said, leadership, as opposed to the leaders that do it, leadership itself has been considered in lots of different ways. I mean, the literature is vast and has got a long history. If you look back in the 60s and 70s in particular, in the early part of the 80s, leadership was sort of an embodiment of what was in a good leader. So it was very much about the individuals that were leading organisations. And within there you would try and look at thinking about things like traits. What traits have they got? What styles and behaviours do they particularly embody at particular times? When do you use one approach over another approach? And what kind of skills is it that we should learn in order to be better leaders? Now there's nothing wrong with that in itself, particularly as a developmental way of thinking about what it is that you bring to a particular set of circumstances. But I say, of course, leadership, the ability to make things happen and the ability to try and influence the situation and define what needs to be happened amongst people, is something that is intrinsically relational. It involves working with other people. And in the 1980s and into the early part of the 90s, this really started to come to the fore, and the idea of leadership as a relationship. Now that's not to say necessarily that it's a fully social process, because it still had that lingering sense that it was an individual who was going to deliver on these things. So if you looked at approaches like, for example, transformational and charismatic leadership, the idea was within there that there are these special individuals who somehow instantiate a particular set of relations with those that are round about them that allows things to happen. It makes things that makes things happen. As we progressed, and that sort of idea of the great individual started to slightly lose its glow. We got the idea of servant leadership, of those that are maybe slightly more reserved but facilitate and intervene at particular times to ensure that others are feel empowered and take things forward. So we've moved progressively within there to see that leadership can be part of a relationship, and that's an important thing that we should be thinking about, or a possibility for action. And it's led on into sort of today's thinking about leadership to say, well, do you know what? It isn't just about this kind of stuff of the individual and what the expectations that fall on them. The expectations that fall on an individual as a leader are also those that reflect the social part of that group, the heart of what people are expecting. So maybe what we should be looking is not at the individual themselves. We should be looking at the set of prevailing circumstances and the way in which the context starts to influence what they do and can do over it. Now that's going to be really important, that when we come to the idea of, we look back at the idea of Vara's idea of legitimacy and authority to work over the in the organisation. But it's also going to be when we go on to the next section about change agency, to look at what can we do. And what can we do is not limitless. It's limited by all types of things, in particular by the social dynamics in which we come to act. So I believe that was Bolden's taxonomy of those three types of leadership. One thing that I would have in mind, and they themselves actually come to the conclusion to say, well, look, if I looked across all of these different ways of thinking about leadership, I would have to come to the conclusion that leadership is a process which involves social influence, and it guides and facilitates relationships towards the achievement of shared, to an extent, aims. Okay, so it really much does, as we'll go on to look at the change agency slides, it really does emphasize this idea of influencing. Okay. You start to see that as being something that's really practical if you have a look at and you read the case of change that Anne Adamson and Dornbush have done in Genentech Biotech. They went in kind of going, I want to see what's going on here. Is it great man leadership? Is it relational stuff? Or what is it that I'm seeing that goes on there? And it's a nice case that sort of picks some of the presumptions about where leadership emanates from. It's not necessarily from the leader or even from a leadership group. It's leadership as a group exercise. So it's about that social dynamic that's going around in here. And that's important. It sort of links up with our sort of underlying theme through our course, which is a more complex engagement, that we're not going to get perhaps hearing people from Aviva who may be in leadership programs, but it's not them themselves that are doing all of this stuff. They are facilitating the relationships and trying to encourage a particular set of actions amongst all of the people that are around about them to enable change to happen. Okay, so that sort of again sort of reflects what happened in Genentech. Leaders need to be able to identify and manage change and create the paths for successful development. They are facilitating change and being facilitated by change and shaped by the nature of the context. And that kind of feeds into what Gosling is talking about, a man who every time I see his name I have to think Ryan, but it's not Ryan. But when he talks about change, he talks about, well, you have to think about the difference of the context and how it shapes the way in which you have to act. And one of those dynamics that you really should be thinking about is the balance between change and what has to be different and disrupted and what has to be continuous and hold in the background. So that leans backwards towards a kaleidoscope, looking at aspects like preservation, to think about how far am I changing this and what is it that I'm going to try and preserve. Now, all of that stuff that talks about what might be going on in the context feeds into a little bit into the article by Myers, Hulks and Wiggins. Okay, not Bradley, but that's a really interesting one because they sort of take the same kind of look at leadership as something that leaders are expected to enact, and they turn it round the other way to say, well, in these different types of change, which kind of relate back to the Van de Ven model, what can these different contexts of change, these different types of change, what is it that people are being expected to do? And if you look at those particular roles, and then you connect it back to look at something like the Vara model that says, well, how do you engage with the discursive realm, the ideas that are around about it, and how do you enact in such a way that your legitimacy is held together and you're making material changes that allows you to exercise your authority. Those kind of ones fit in really nicely to the way that they describe those leadership roles of what leaders would be doing in those particular circumstances. So there we have it, leadership and change in 9 minutes and 29 seconds. Impressed?